There is a stone tool from a rock shelter in northern Australia that, according to the sand it was buried in, is 65,000 years old. If that holds, it is the oldest evidence of modern humans anywhere outside Africa, and the timeline for how our species spread is off by 15,000 years. But that is a very big if. Respected names in the field have argued for a decade that the number is inflated, that the tools are younger than the sand. Tonight, we lay out both sides and what breaks if the ground is telling the truth. The place is called Madjedbebe. It sits at the base of a sandstone escarpment in Arnhem Land, in Australia's Northern Territory, on a floodplain that runs green in the wet season and cracks red in the dry. For years, the scientific papers called it Malakunanja II. The senior traditional owners call it Madjedbebe, and that is the name it carries now. It is a wide overhang of rock, around 50 meters of shelter along the base of the cliff, the kind of place that offered shade and a dry floor to anyone crossing that country. And people have been crossing that country for a very long time. This is Mirarr land, and the ground it sits on is one of the strangest pieces of real estate in Australia. Madjedbebe is not inside Kakadu National Park. It is surrounded by it. The shelter falls inside a lease that was cut out of the park for something else entirely, which was uranium. The Ranger mine ran a few kilometers away for 40 years, and right beside the shelter is Jabiluka, one of the richest undeveloped uranium deposits on Earth, a deposit the Mirarr fought for decades to keep in the ground. Hold on to that, because it comes back at the end, and not in the way you might expect. When the archaeologists returned to dig in 2012, and again in 2015, they did not come on their own terms. The excavation ran under an agreement that handed the Mirarr, through their corporation, real control over the work, including a right of veto over what happened on their country. That kind of control was rare in archaeology. It is also the reason the next part of the story is as detailed as it is, because what came out of that sand was not a handful of stone chips. Over 2 digging seasons, the team recorded the exact 3-dimensional position of around 11,000 stone artifacts and features, mapping where every hearth, every pit, and every worked stone sat in the deposit. More than 10,000 of them came from the deepest band of occupation, the oldest layer in the shelter. And that layer did not look primitive. The headline object is the one from the opening. A hatchet head with a ground and polished cutting edge. Grinding a stone edge smooth instead of just chipping it is a slow, deliberate technology, and the examples from Madjedbebe are described as the oldest ground edge axes known anywhere in the world. Not the oldest in Australia, the oldest anywhere. There was more. Grinding stones carrying the residue of processed seeds, among the earliest evidence for seed grinding known outside Africa, which means these people were doing real food preparation, not just cracking things open. There were crayons of ochre worn down to a working point, the way you wear down a pencil. And there was one piece that stops you cold. A sheet of reflective mica wrapped around a ground lump of yellow ochre. Reflective pigment, something that catches the light. That is not survival. That is somebody making something to be looked at. The layers held the remains of ancient meals, too. Charred fragments of fruits and nuts, and the tissue of underground tubers that had been dug up and roasted, the earliest record of plant food on the whole continent by more than 20,000 years. These were people who knew their landscape well enough to eat from all of it. And then there is the object that sounds invented, but is not. In the upper, much younger layers, the team recovered the upper jaw of a thylacine, a Tasmanian tiger, its bone coated in red ochre, an animal now extinct on the mainland, its jaw deliberately painted, resting in the same shelter. Put it together, and the picture is uncomfortable for the old model. The old model said the first people in Australia were simple, that sophistication arrived later, that ground stone tools and worked pigment and long-distance planning were things that developed slowly over tens of thousands of years on the continent. Madjedbebe says the toolkit was already advanced at the very bottom, which left only one question, the one that turns an interesting local site into a global one. How old is the bottom? To answer that, the team did not date the artifacts. They dated the sand. The method is called single-grain optically stimulated luminescence, and the idea behind it is strange and elegant. Buried quartz grains soak up a tiny, steady dose of natural radiation from the ground around them, and that energy stays locked inside the grain until it is exposed to sunlight, which resets the clock to 0. Measure how much trapped energy a grain is holding, and you can calculate how long it has been since that grain last saw daylight. In plain terms, how long it has been buried. The word that matters is single grain. Instead of dating a whole scoop of sand at once and averaging it, they measured thousands of individual grains, one at a time. That is what lets you see whether a deposit is clean or whether younger and older grains have been stirred together. They ran 56 samples this way. They sent some of them to a second laboratory to be measured independently to check the answer held. And they backed the whole thing up with radiocarbon dating on charcoal from ancient fireplaces. When all of it went into a statistical model, the age for the start of human occupation came back at 65,000 years, give or take about 6,000. The team was careful to state a conservative floor. Even at the cautious end of the error range, the site was at least 59,000 years old. Now sit with what that number does. The mainstream estimate for humans reaching Australia had been somewhere around 47,000 to 50,000 years. Madjedbebe was not nudging that timeline. It was shoving it back by 15,000 years or more and planting a flag that read, "We were here, this far into a new continent, before almost anyone thought it was possible." And that is where the field split in two. Before we get into that fight, if you want more of these, the deep time discoveries that do not fit the textbook, take a second and subscribe. We have a whole run of them coming. Now, the split. The problem is the sand itself. Madjedbebe is not a sealed cave with neat, rock-hard layers. It is a shelter floor made of loose, dry sand, and loose sand moves. Things buried in it can work their way downward over tens of thousands of years. Rain seeps through and shifts the grains. Insects and small animals burrow. In tropical northern Australia, termites tunnel through almost everything, and people themselves dig pits, light fires, and walk across the same floor for thousands of years, pressing whatever is underfoot a little deeper each time. Here is why that is not a small technicality. The date does not come from the axe. It comes from the grains of sand around the axe. If that axe was dropped on the surface 50,000 years ago and then slowly sank through the sand until it was resting beside grains that had been buried for 65,000 years, then the sand is telling you one age, and the tool is a different, younger age. The dating would be perfectly accurate and completely misleading at the same time. You would have a real 65,000-year-old grain of sand cradling a 50,000-year-old axe. You would call the site 65,000 years old, and you would be wrong. This is the heart of the objection, and it is not coming from cranks. It is coming from some of the most established figures in Australian archaeology. Researchers including James O'Connell, Jim Allen, and Martin Williams have argued for years that the securely dated evidence for humans in this region points to around 50,000 years, not 65,000, and that the deeper dates at sites like this one are inflated by exactly this kind of mixing. In a 2018 paper, a group of them examined the Madjedbebe claim directly and concluded that an age of more than 50,000 years for the site was, in their words, unlikely to be valid. They have a second argument, and it is a strong one. If people were standing in northern Australia 65,000 years ago, they had to have island hopped there through what is now Indonesia. But the oldest solid evidence for humans on those stepping stone islands is around 45,000 years old. So the claim asks us to believe that people reached Australia 20,000 years before they left a single trace on the islands they supposedly crossed to get there. That is a real gap, and nobody has filled it. Now here is the other side, because the team did not just assert the date and walk away. They went back through the deposit hunting for evidence of mixing, and they built a case that not much had happened. They found stone pieces that fit back together, tools that had broken in antiquity, and whose fragments were recovered close to one another in the same layer, which is hard to explain if everything had been sliding around for that long. 14 of those refits sat inside the lower band. Not one of them crossed between the upper and lower layers. The raw materials in the deep layer were different from the ones above it, a difference that heavy mixing would have smeared away. There were intact fireplaces, still in one piece, and they ran experiments on the actual floor, trampling the sediment to measure how far objects really travel, and reported that the movement was small, on the order of a few centimeters, not the meters the objection would require. Their conclusion, in the formal reply they published to their critics, was blunt. The evidence, they wrote, pointed to multiple intact phases of occupation beginning around 65,000 years ago. And that is the frustrating shape of this whole dispute. Both sides are staring at the same sand, the same tools, the same numbers, and reading them in opposite directions. Neither camp can simply run the test again, because an excavation is a one-way door. Once the sediment is dug out, the exact relationship between each grain and each tool is gone, preserved in notebooks and photographs, but never again observable in the ground. And an age this deep sits close to the practical ceiling of what radiocarbon can even reach, which is exactly why so much of the weight lands on the sand grains instead. This is not two teams being stubborn. It is a genuinely hard problem at the ragged edge of what the methods can resolve. So who is right? A decade on, the honest answer is that the field has not closed the case. And in 2025, the argument picked up a new weapon from a completely different direction: our own DNA. Every person alive outside Africa carries a small amount of Neanderthal DNA, the genetic trace of our ancestors interbreeding with Neanderthals after they left Africa and moved into Eurasia. Aboriginal Australians carry it too, and recent genetic work has pinned down when that interbreeding happened with real precision. The main pulse of Neanderthal mixing into modern humans is now dated to a window between roughly 50,500 and 43,500 years ago. Follow the logic. If the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians carry Neanderthal DNA, they had to have still been part of that population when the mixing happened, somewhere back in Eurasia. And that mixing was still going on as recently as around 45,000 years ago. So how could their descendants already have been living in a rock shelter in Australia 20,000 years before the interbreeding that shows up in their own genome had even finished? In 2025, the same skeptics who had spent years questioning the sand, O'Connell and Allen, made exactly that argument. The genetics, they said, do not fit a 65,000-year arrival. They fit something much closer to 50,000. This is the strongest single challenge the date has faced. But it is not a knockout, and honesty means saying why. Genetic dating carries its own error bars, and other genomic studies have placed the deep split of Aboriginal Australian ancestors from other populations much earlier, some of them beyond 50,000, and in a few estimates as far back as 70,000 years. The DNA and the dirt are pulling hard against each other, and neither one has produced a number clean enough to end the fight. What we can say is that the burden has shifted. That date now has to answer to the genome as well as to the sand. So step back and ask the question that actually matters. If the early date is right, what does it change? Two things, and both are big. The first is the story of how our species left Africa and filled the world. The standard timeline has modern humans making the great push out of Africa and into Asia somewhere around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. A secure human presence in Australia at 65,000 years does not just tweak that. It means people had already crossed the whole of Asia and made open water crossings to a separate continent by then, which forces the entire departure from Africa earlier and faster than the tidy version allows. That is why this one site, in one shelter, on one floodplain, matters to people who have never set foot in Australia. It is a load-bearing date. Move it, and a lot of other dates have to move with it. The second thing is a mystery about death. When the first humans arrived in Australia, the continent was ruled by giants. Marsupial lions, a wombat relative the size of a car, giant flightless birds heavier than any bird alive today. And within a few thousand years of humans spreading across the land, almost all of them were gone. The argument over why has run for decades. Was it climate, a drying continent squeezing them out? Or was it us, hunting slow-breeding animals that had never before seen a predator like a human? Here is where Madjedbebe lands a punch. If people were here that early, then humans and megafauna shared this continent for around 20,000 years before the extinctions, not a few violent centuries. 20,000 years of coexistence is very hard to square with a story of people wiping the giants out on arrival. It does not settle the debate, but it tilts the table away from us as the simple villains. Unless, of course, the date is wrong, in which case the overlap shrinks and the case against us gets easier to make all over again. So let us go back to that uranium, because this is where the story refuses to become the one you might have expected. When a globally important Aboriginal site sits directly on top of one of the richest uranium deposits on Earth, it is easy to imagine a cover-up, a discovery quietly buried to clear the way for a mine. That is not what happened. There is no evidence that the archaeology was ever suppressed, or hidden, or spun to serve the mine. If anything, the opposite is true. The Mirarr, the people who held the veto over the dig, are the reason the site was studied so carefully and defended so fiercely. And in 2024, after a fight that ran for more than 40 years, they won. The government refused to renew the Jabiluka lease and moved to fold the land into Kakadu National Park. The uranium stays in the ground. The deposit sitting next to the oldest known home in Australia will never be mined, and the senior traditional owner who had said no to that mine her entire adult life said her country would be safe now, for good. That leaves the number, and the number is still not settled. The critics are still waiting on the full excavation report, and they point out, fairly, that a decade after the headline, it has not yet appeared. The 65,000-year date is not a proven fact. It is a serious, carefully argued, fiercely contested claim, and it may yet be revised down toward 50,000 before this is over. But strip the fight away and look at what nobody disputes. Deep in the sand under that overhang, real people ground the edges of stone axes, wore ochre down to a nub, wrapped mica so it would catch the light, roasted food they had gathered across the country, and returned to the same shelter for tens of thousands of years. Their descendants are still on that land. they never left. And whether the final answer lands at 50,000 years or 65,000 years, it is longer than almost any continuous human story anywhere on Earth. The date is still being argued, one grain of sand at a time.